Okay, good morning. Whoa. I am super nervous. First of all, I walk around a lot when I talk, so I apologize. I have to tell you a quick story. So my brother worked in sexual health for years at the Columbus Public Health Department. And he's much older than me and my other brother. And my brother taught me about harm reduction at a really early age. And one of the ways he did it was he had a book, and I'm sure each of you has this book, that is a very graphic description of STDs, and they show pictures. And so he would sit the book on the table, and he would open it, but he wouldn't say anything. And he would leave it there for me and my brother to be scared. And I know scaring kids doesn't work. I know it from a prevention. But can I tell you something? It worked for me and my brother. When I saw something that looked like cauliflower and it was a human being, I was like, that's not something I want. So part of my job today is to really educate about the opioid epidemic, but to put it in terms, as I like to say it, is to translate so that you can send a greater message. We are struggling in this state, and I don't like it. I don't like being called by national news and local news to be told, hey, why is Ohio the epicenter of this epidemic? I'm going to go over this presentation, but I'm going to kind of go off script a little bit to make it make sense to the work that you do. So when I say we're number one in the nation, this is from the CDC Wonder website, which often provides fantastic data, but unfortunately, it can be very depressing. In 2015, we were number 3 in the nation for unintentional opioid overdose deaths. In 2016, we were number 1. I guess true to being the Buckeyes that we are, we want to be number 1 at everything, including death. And one of the things that we have to do is translate that, tell people what that really means. We're not number 1 in landmass. We're not number 1 in population, but we're number 1 in unintentional overdose deaths. What does that look like? So when I was hired to do this, I had to sit around the table and kind of digest data from the Department of Health, from CDC, even from Medicaid. And something became very obvious to me. One of the first things is whenever people start talking about the disease of addiction, and more specifically about drugs and drug trafficking, the first thing we want to do is point a finger. And so the first thing I was hearing is cartels, heroin, cartels, heroin. I have a lot of opinions as to why that is, but I think it's a misnomer, especially when you look at the data. Because in 2012, only 36% of the patients died from heroin overdose. So that's the cartel illicit. So the overwhelming majority died from pills. And that's not a cartel sitting in a corner making pills. That's a doctor who's prescribing, right? So how is it we get to a point where we're absolutely okay as long as a doctor prescribes it? How many of you have had a major surgery? A major, no wimpy stuff. Okay, what'd you have? Okay. I was incapacitated for a long time. And what'd they give you? Darvocet, Percocet, Oxycontin. Okay. Okay. Now, here's the thing that's important, especially when you explain it to young people. If I give you the molecular structure, and clearly I went into social work for a reason. I'm not a scientist. This is the molecular structure. Everybody can see that back there? Of heroin. You got it? This is the molecular structure of Percocet. Essentially, your Percocet, your Darvocet, your Oxycontin is pharmaceutical heroin. The only difference is its form. Sometimes they add a sulfate to it in order for it to be absorbed into the body. If I said to you after your surgery, hey, listen, what I'm going to prescribe for you, I'm going to give you 3 balloons of heroin a day, and I want you to take that for the next 3 months. Would you be okay? 3 balloons of heroin. No. Exactly. But when a doctor in a white coat prescribes something, it's easier for us to swallow. And unfortunately, the doctors throughout have been duped by pharmaceutical companies because there was a major push that pain is the 5th vital sign, but it's not. Vital means breathing. vital means heart rate. The fifth vital sign of pain was something that was pushed out by lobbyists. Let me give you an example. My mother had cancer on the base of her skull and on her spine. When she went into the hospital, they give you a survey when you're about to leave. And one of the questions they ask you is, did we adequately deal with your pain? Now, my mother, being ever so Janice, said, this is a run-on sentence. And the way that you've written it actually implies that I shouldn't have pain. But I have cancer. And cancer could and possibly should hurt. And the woman was very upfront. She said, the thing is, we get evaluated on these responses. We get accredited by JACO and CARF. That thing you see with U.S. News and World Report top hospitals is directly tied to this as a customer satisfaction. So this is pushed not really by being taken care of well and healing. It's pushed because of money. So all of this has a great tie. Now, you can't go in depth about this with young people, but one thing that I've had to do is educate what is pain. And we're going to get to that in a bit. So when I go back and I'm like, okay, well, obviously this is primarily from pills and our approach has to be a little bit different. Here's the reality. Doctors, nurses, dentists, even veterinarians, guess how much time they get on pain management in school? The vets get the most. They get 14 hours because animals can't speak and they have to be able to evaluate pain. Physicians, 7 hours. So one of our goals at the Governor's Cabinet Opiate Action Team, the roundtable, is to start meeting with medical schools, with deans of schools, with allied health professionals and saying, you know what, we need to change the curriculum. That's really difficult to do. The other thing that we had to do was say, let's put our arms around this and talk to the physicians about their prescribing protocols and maybe come up with new prescribing guidelines. So the first guideline we came up with was the emergency departments. It used to be you could go into the emergency department and get you 3 days of medication, or I'm sorry, 30 days of medication. And then they'd say after that, you know, follow up with your doctor, but we're gonna give you 30 days to cover you. Now you can only get 3 to 4 days, especially if it's a 3 or 4 day holiday. That's huge. The next thing was chronic care. Now, chronic care is obviously a little more difficult because you are talking about cancers, all types of cancers, and not wanting people to suffer in pain, which we get. And so our guidelines around that really were, you're the treating physician. You know your patient best, period. The next one that comes out is the acute care guidelines. The acute care for injuries like not yours seems significant, but when you have a knee surgery, a rotator cuff surgery, or again, acute care, something that isn't going to take too long in terms of operation or recovery time. And what we found overwhelmingly was the number of pills that were being prescribed for that type of condition were shocking. So shocking that for every man, woman, and child in the state of Ohio, there were 65.5 pills prescribed. 65.5 opioids. And remember what I said an opioid was, right? So this pill became currency in impoverished communities, and most specifically in southeastern Ohio, because the manufacturing plants had gone down, but you still had people who had the medication. So I can't pay you $20 to cut my grass, but I can give you a 20 perk. So for every milligram, it was $1. The value goes up, right? In rural communities, you could actually potentially get more. And so when we went for the prescribing guidelines, here's the difficulty. Man, sitting around a table of 75 people who are doctors, nurses, attorneys, and lobbyists is a huge challenge, because the first thing they say is, you're not going to tell me what to do. I went to school. You're right. But what this data tells me is some lessons got lost, because we go from the pills to the next thing. When you cut a patient off from the medication after they've been taking it for a long time, what happens is they may say, I still feel pain. I still hurt. Well, I'm sorry, your range of motion is back. We've given you physical therapy. We've given you the medication you need. We can't justify giving this to you anymore. Okay, so now I'm going to teach you what happens with young people. And I use myself as an example. So my brother was 14, I was 16. We had a cousin named June who was an independent pharmaceutical sales representative. That is to say, he was a drug dealer. He pushed marijuana, right? And here's the thing, there is business acumen. Just like there is with this pharmaceutical company, there's business acumen with a drug dealer. And so what he did was he said, y'all need to try it, right? Now, that wasn't hard because we used to light my mother's cigarettes on the stove, and we were supposed to just hold it. But me and my brother, not the older one who was like a saint, me and my brother would, hit it. So it was fine. Okay, we'll try it. So my brother tries it first. And when he hit it, his response in his face was like he just smelled skunk all up in. And he said it. Did you roll this in skunk? Like, what is this? And my cousin said, you a punk. Hit it again. That's peer pressure, right? You never want to be, especially at the age of 16, for an older man to call a younger man a punk was a challenge. So he hit it again. My brother said, nah, that's not for me. I don't like it. Now me, I'm 14 years old. I hit it. He didn't even have to tell me to hit it again. It was fantastic. In my mind, I'm thinking, I can't believe this hasn't solved the world. I see Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and Confucius, and we need to come together on this. Now, why? This is the important lesson as to why. Because you have to look at what was happening developmentally between my brother and I. You have to look at my entire being versus that one episode. It's real easy, especially as adults who are a little more have been formed a little more, to say, you know what, you really shouldn't have used that. Well, let me paint a picture for you. We lived in public housing, and we're the only system in the world that paints all public housing with the same color door so that everybody knows you're poor. You can't hide. We know you're poor. Back in the day, even through the health department, when you got glasses, they gave you all the same type of glasses, so everybody also knew you were poor. We grew up in a 5-room house. I slept in the same bed as my mother till I was 15. Playing a sport, I played with Chuck Taylors, and those weren't fly shoes. Those were painful shoes to play a sport in. I was short, fat, and proud of that like Winnie the Pooh, and I really wasn't that bright. And so when you look at that psyche, right, of a 14-year-old girl, and by the way, my mother doted on my brothers. She had them. My mother actually said once, women love their sons and raise their daughters. So what does that do to my psyche? My brother was already validated, right? I wasn't. So when I smoked that gave me every sense of validation possible. So when people say, I can't believe you choose drugs over. I can't believe you chose. You know what? I didn't choose drugs. I chose to use once, but the drug chose me. And when people say, well, you know what, but it's a moral choice. I'm sorry, I can describe for you from the frontal lobe all the way to the back of the brain where memory is held. No, your brain is hijacked. And with this specific drug, it's even worse. So I'm going to give you some descriptions of what happens, right? But first, let's go back to the data. So you have the 36%. We come up with the prescribing protocols. And by the way, when I told you there's 65.5 pills for every man, woman, and child in Ohio, how many do you think are given to those in Europe? And remember, Europe is like all those wonderful countries we want to travel to, right? Spain, Italy, France, used to be England, but because of Brexit, it's not. But how many do you think they get? For every man, woman, and child? 2. So what does that tell you about our culture? What does that tell you about how we are? We are the greatest country on the face of the earth, and we're going to get what we want, when we want it, the way we want it. Let your cell phone not work in here. You'll lose your mind. Go to a Starbucks coffee line and have to wait for more than 3 minutes. All of a sudden, you're evaluating, how much money do I spend on Starbucks every month? I need to invest this money because you want what you want when you want it. And what's happened to us culturally with regard to pain is we shouldn't have to deal with pain. We're the most advanced country in the world, right? So once the person stops taking the medication, here's what we do. This is what Junie taught us. You pinch the bottle. So I'll go to your house. I'll go to Auntie's house. I'll go up to her bathroom. I'll take 2 pills from her. I'll go to your house. I'll take 2 pills from you. I'll go to your house. I'll even say, hey, can I go to your upstairs bathroom? Because I feel like I have to have a bowel movement. Because there's no shame at this point. right? So now I've got me enough pills to get through, and I still don't know what the effects are going to be. So much so you can look at Coles Boyers out of Clark County. He took one pill one time and he died. He was 16 years old. You know what the pill was? They were having a Skittles party at the school. You know what a Skittles party is? If you're going to work with the population, know the language, know the terms. And so what he did is he took the blue pill. The blue pill was morphine. This kid was an athlete, very little fat on his body. They took him to the hospital, they flushed him, sent him home and said, hey, just make sure you check on him every couple of hours. Danielle goes to check on him at 1 o'clock in the morning and he's not breathing. This is no joke when we talk about the severity, but trying to get young people to understand it is really difficult. So the terms I'm giving you, pharmaceutical heroin, a Skittles party can lead to death. Look up Coles Warriors because they will travel and come speak with you. Once we get on top of it, and I feel like we're doing a pretty decent job, all of a sudden the numbers start changing. Clearly, if I can't get the pill from you and I'm no longer able to pinch the bottles because people have caught on, right? Now I got to go to the street. And now I'm paying for that one Percocet, I'm paying $30. And if I'm a business person, also the drug dealer, what I say is, listen, for that $30 pill, which is only going to keep you happy for 6 hours, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 balloons of heroin, and you'll be good for a day and a half. I'm not threatening, right? I'm not pushing it hard. It's a logical conversation. Oh, I'm not going to bang dope. Okay. You don't have to. You can just sprinkle it on a cigarette or something. If you want, you can just snort it. It's not that. So now I'm not threatening. I'm not pushing. But I know that once you take it, I got you. And the point is, we transitioned. We went from the pharmaceutical industry to the drug industry. And we treat both like they're different, but they're actually the same. The motivation is making money. And it's making money off of people who simply don't know better. So when we switch over to heroin, and I'm like, okay, I think we're on top of this. I think we can do it. What we're going to do is we're going to create medication-assisted treatment programs using methadone, Vivitrol, and Suboxone. We're going to start some drug courts so that people can, try and keep custody of their children and we can get them into treatment. Let's look at recovery housing and sober supports so that, people have safe places to stay and they don't have to go back into the thick of it. And just as we think we're ahead of it, fentanyl hits. And so what is fentanyl? Fentanyl is used in the chronic condition of cancer, usually a patch or a lollipop. And so I started thinking okay, how is it that we went from 4 deaths from fentanyl in 2013 to 504? Is there any way that we can, were there pharmacies that were knocked off? Were there trucks like the days of the mafia being hit on the turnpike? How is this happening? Nope, nothing's missing. We worked with the Board of Pharmacy, the medical board, nothing's missing. So where is it coming from? Well, the cartels and the mafia hired scientists and created clandestine labs and said, show us how to make this fentanyl. The difference is, when you have something coming out from a pharmaceutical company, they have to meet the standards of the FDA, right? There's no standards for the cartel and the mafia. There is, just get me a batch so I can step on my heroin so I can spread it to get more customers and be told that I have the best high, right? The thing is about fentanyl, it's 1,000 times more potent than the Percocet that she was taking. It's so potent that 8 children in the state of Ohio have died because they got into their parents' stash and they touched it and it absorbed and lowered the heart rate and caused death. We have police officers who are now calling, who we just convinced to start carrying naloxone to save people from an overdose, especially in those 32 Appalachian counties, because they're often the first responders there, not the EMTs. We just got them carrying it, right? And yet there was an officer in East Liverpool who overdosed after he responded to a scene because he was pulling the carpet out from where they had tried to smudge the stuff in the carpet. He was cool. He had his gloves on. He had his mask on. He ends up going back to the station, and he wipes powder off his shirt. It absorbs into the skin, and he's taken to the hospital. When I say this stuff is no joke, it's no joke. So then when we go even further, and now our deaths are sky, it's 14%, 14%, oh my God, 20% raise in death, right? And here you see, in 52% of those deaths in 2016, over half were from fentanyl. So when officers say, you know what, should I get protective equipment? Yeah, if over half, I absolutely would assume that any house, any situation I go into where heroin or opioids are being used, it is likely that fentanyl is going to be present. And you must take protective measures. I'm not all doom and gloom. I'm very hopeful. So as we get on our prescribing and we start thinking, okay, how are we going to interdict? How are we going to help people get access to treatment? Well, let's see if this is really a problem. So in 2001, the red counties are the counties where we knew, and that's where we did start the deploying of the addiction treatment pilot program, the drug courts. That is where we did some capital investment on recovery and treatment centers. And I mean, that's kind of somewhat doable, right? And we're working with the boards, the alcohol, drug, and mental health boards and health departments in these areas, saying, okay, let's go at this. So that's 2001. That's 2014. So just when you think we can get ahead of it, there is no way. And whenever people say the state, the state, the state, this is beyond the state. This is the state, the county, the city, the township. This is the entire community. And what we know is prevention works. And we have to educate people. Here's the difference, not just young people. Because the population that's dying is known as the opiate naive. The one who goes to take the pill naturally and ends up becoming addicted. So what's going on? So when I told you about my childhood stuff, I always think it's important, especially I used to work with young people. I always give a little bit of myself because they're going to be giving a lot to you. The frontal lobe is key. This section of my brain, the purpose is logical thinking, fight or flight, which is survival, and pleasure seeking. Pleasure seeking that is rooted in our bones because of procreation and making sure that we survive. But pleasure seeking isn't just sex. It's food, gambling, shopping, concerts. When I took my first hit, this region, which does perception, was wide open. And it sent, I do this in the simplest forms, okay? It sent a message to the back of my head that said, oh, this is good and this is right. You need to go back and get some more. The problem is when my brother did it, this was closed off. So it was a block. So it shot back and said, yeah, nothing good here, nothing good to come from that. So whenever I got upset, my memory would kick and fire back to my frontal lobe of fight, flight, survival, right? So it's a constant message. When I try to, let me show you this. This is perhaps the better way to explain it. The message center is important. This part of my brain is telling me this. Do your arm like this. Okay, I got it. Andrea, you're hungry. Okay, I'll go eat. Andrea, you're sleepy. Okay, go sleep. But when you start taking a drug, and specifically an opioid, all those messages get blocked because you actually already have opioid receptors in your brain. But what happens when you start ingesting an opioid is that receptor starts to block up, right? And so now the messages aren't firing like they're supposed to. And so have you ever seen a person who's sick on dope? How many of you have seen this? I saw a guy on a New York City bus once, had a wallet full of money open, almost fall down, hit his head on the pole. I did see him get robbed as well, and he couldn't respond. I've seen people, when I ran the drug court, who hadn't eaten in 6 days. What happens when that receptor's full? Messages don't go through. If you see it, like, how many of you remember Lily Tomlin when she was on Laugh-In and she played the switchboard operator? And so the message had to go through and it would come back. Well, now she's trying to plug in and she can't do it. And that's a really good example to use with young people because you can also teach them history about something called a rotary phone. So you have to plug in. You have to plug in, and I can't plug in. So what happens 3 days after you stop taking it? The receptor starts to empty. And the receptor, when it starts to empty after 3 days, is someone in the jail yelling at me, you need to get her out of here because she's going to die. She's defecating, pooping all over herself. She's throwing up. She's thriving in pain. The thing is, you may feel like you're going to die, but you're not going to die. So when people say to me, well, wait a minute, why would they go back to using? I used to run the human trafficking court here. And one of the judges would say to me, oh my God, she was in treatment for 6 months. She got to revisit her children. She was established in a relationship. Why would she leave? And I said, well, let me ask you a question. Let me put on your judge's robe. Give me your wallet, give me your cell phone, and let me put you up in a trap house. And tell me how safe you feel. When she's in treatment, she felt safe until one of the groups was on trauma, sexual trauma, and childhood. And that memory kicked, and the flight or fight survival came in, and she said, this is the devil I know, and this is the devil I don't want to deal with. That's why she left. So we always have to create a trauma-informed care environment, one where we're conscious of the fact that just because it may not be traumatic to you, doesn't mean it's not traumatic to that child. Being poor for me was traumatic. Being from a single-parent home during my generation in my community was traumatic. Now, my mother used to get upset with it all the time. She said, I was poor. We were dirt poor. Okay. Don't try and measure someone else's pain and someone else's trauma. And don't assume that you can even put yourself in their shoes. It's very difficult to do. So I've given you the message center, and I will send this to you. And I've gone over with you what happens with the brain in terms of when these receptors start getting blocked up and the messages aren't going through. Right. Whatever you do is a result of the brain. So I went over all this for you, but I want you to be able to articulate it in the same way and make it easy. This is my favorite. What happens when the message center is clogged up? I can't sleep, I can't eat, and I can't poo. Kids love that one. For many, the addiction of opioids start here. And so when I gave you the graphic of what happens, or what the medication is, this is the graphic. It literally is the same molecular structure. You might have one offshoot of a carbon, but it's pretty much the same thing. When I talked about the extreme, how each one of these medications gets worse and worse, and each one of these drugs becomes worse and worse, this is perhaps the one that captures the attention of most. And fentanyl, as I said, is still being made illicitly, but have you heard recently of the carfentanil? Carfentanil is used on pachyderms. It's used on elephants, rhinoceros, to put them down. And again, what we're thinking is, why would anyone ever want that? Well, because young people consider themselves omnipotent. That's part of the process. They also consider themselves, they are the best scientists ever, because they will give a hypothesis and they will try to prove it. And that's normal. Testing is normal. So when someone says, you want to try this carfentanil, the other thing that you have to understand, even with the adult, is even if a person dies of an overdose, and I've talked to so many people who've witnessed them, they always say, but I knew that wasn't going to happen to me. He couldn't handle it. He was a punk. I can handle it. I haven't met one who has survived a carfentanil. I've met a couple who've survived fentanyl, but they ended up receiving multiple doses of Narcan. This is the amount, and I don't even think you can see the carfentanil amount. So this is the amount of heroin that can kill you. This is fentanyl. It's like granular salt. And there's 2 little pieces of carfentanil. So what happens? The thing is, the heart rate slows. You're no longer able to take in oxygen, and essentially you have heart failure. So when we talk about it again, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more about the state, this is a chronic progressive disease that can ultimately lead to death. What other diseases do that? Diabetes. It's a chronic progressive disease that can lead to death. Cancer, chronic progressive can lead to death. But because of who we are, we've tied this directly to morality and character flaw. And I know the young people that we're serving have family members who have this disease. And if we continue to say it's a moral issue, then essentially what you're saying to that child is they are flawed. And they're not. It's a disease. The first time my mother went to smoke, absolutely, her choice. But I dare any one of you say that my mother chose cancer. Same thing with diabetes. I'm diabetes. I did have a bite of that tuxedo cheesecake last night. Why? Because I take my medication, I exercise, I understand the full scope of what I have to do. Well, this disease is no different. It isn't just about stop using. It's too complicated for that. And it's also chronic. So even when people have been in recovery for, say, 3 years, the disease is still with them, and they can still be triggered by it. So what we have to do is not just kind of prepare them for what that looks like, but we also have to make it, I'm trying to say this in like the most politically correct ways because he's got cameras rolling. We have to make sure that the people we serve, because that's what we do, we are of service, understand the disease nature and understand, just like any other disease, everyone's susceptible to it. And it doesn't matter what the environment is. It doesn't matter if you grow up poor, if you grow up rich. In fact, what our data tells us is 92% of the people who are affected by this are white. The overwhelming majority who are dying are between the ages of 34 and 44 white males who are educated, high school education at a minimum. So what do we do to educate the young people as well as adults? We have to break it down in its simplest form and let them know that this is a disease that can be treated and there's hope. Here's the hope. And this is where I perhaps, and you'll have to give me a time check or like throw up a sign or not. Here's the hope. Medication-assisted treatment has been around for years. More specifically, it came out after the Vietnam War. This isn't the first time we've had this epidemic. Actually, it's not even the second or the third. The first time we had the epidemic was when the railroads were being built. And we didn't have an issue because our railroads got built. And it was primarily Asians. The second time we had the epidemic was when we had Bayer change the formulation and start providing it to women after they gave birth. Because, you know, we women, we get hysterical when 8 pounds come out. And so what they did was they started prescribing, and you had something called the Harrison Act, where they said, you know what? Women are catatonic. They're not taking care of their children. You can no longer prescribe this medication. And if you as a doctor prescribe it, we will prosecute you. There were 3,000 doctors who were prosecuted and lost their medical license and went to jail because of the Harrison Act. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, not just with myself, knowing that my grandmother left home at 12 to clean houses so she could get an education, every career has intergenerational trauma, right? Teachers will talk about generations of students for years to come. Right? Oh, that's so-and-so's brother. That's so-and-so's sister. And this reputation comes before. Well, the same thing with doctors. In fact, do you know who doesn't like serving the disease of addiction the most? Doctors. I don't like their drug seeking. They're hard. They're combative. It's a disease. Let's look at it from a scientific, but regardless. So we have to come up with new ways of treating disease. When we got methadone, it was because of the third time around, after the Vietnam War. But once again, we really didn't give a damn because it was black men. So what we did was we criminalized them and put them in jail. I don't whisper. Because if you really want truth and reconciliation with this particular disease, you need to tell the truth. The African American community is an oral community, an oral tradition community. So we talked about what was happening. The rural communities didn't know. And the message wasn't being sent to the suburbs either. But now, the message is very clear. We have a problem. Methadone came out of the Vietnam War because of what was called the Vet Center. Have you guys seen the Vet Center? Vet centers were established in Watts because people who had dishonorable discharges weren't allowed to receive treatment from the VA. But they came out with trauma. And so what they were seeking to do was to deal with their trauma by continuing to use the opioids. You'll hear a lot of flack about methadone if you don't already. but it's tied to a history. It's tied to African Americans, urban, poverty, and distrust. However, it is the most researched medication in dealing with opioid addiction and shows the greatest success over years. It costs $2 a day. Do you know how much incarcerating a person costs a day? $80 a day. That's if they don't have MRSA, HIV, or hepatitis C, which is on the rise in the state of Ohio as a direct result of this disease, right? So $80 a day, $2 a day. If they have hepatitis, $343 a day to $2 a day. And what you'll hear people say is, well, that's a drug for a drug. They're substituting a drug for a drug. Yep. One of them, I'm not paying $80 or $343 a day. One of them, I'm not concerned about infectious disease from sharing needles. One of them, I actually can get a person to a level of functioning where they can still engage with people and the community is safe. So yeah, is it substituting a drug for a drug? Yes. Is my Januvia substituting for me? Yes. Many of us are on medications and we would never think twice about whether we would take them or not, or whether it was substituting a drug for a drug. It's a disease. The other medication is called Vivitrol. Now Vivitrol is something judges love, because they think it's that like one brush that can save everything. It's the very reason we got here, right? Vivitrol blocks that receptor so that the drug can't get through. Heroin, opiate can't get through for about 28 days. So another judge, when I was running the drug court, he would come in and he'd go, oh my God, why is he so upset? He's been on Vivitrol for 2 months. And I go, uh-huh. I mean, that was just one thing. You never dealt with the fact that he was hit upside the head with a 2x4 from his father. Do you think that, oh, I should be happy now? I should be happy because I've got this medication in me. He's still unemployed. He still has a felony on his record. He still has no place to sleep, but he should come in here skipping. Be realistic about what your expectations are. And so it's not just providing the medication. It's more effective if you have wraparound services, individual, family, group counseling. Because once you've isolated yourself, which is what this drug does, it isolates and insulates you. You actually have to go through some training on how do I get back into society. The other medication is called Suboxone. Again, people don't necessarily like it. You know why? Because it can be diverted. This medication is twofold. It's partial blocker and partial fills that receptor enough so you don't have the craving. They come in sublingual tablets, so like those Listerine things that you can slice, right? Now, when people say it can be diverted, you can't really get high off it. You'd have to take an enormous amount to get high off of it. Typically, when it's diverted, people are trying to stave off getting sick because it's still cheaper than even a balloon of heroin. So people will cut it. But what I like to do is say, can I see which we do with the state medical board and the board of pharmacy, I want to see the doctors who are prescribing. If the recommended dose is 8 to 12 milligrams and you have a doctor prescribing 32 and charging a Medicaid client $360, what do you think of that doctor? Right. Somebody, I didn't say it. Yes, you did. He said drug dealer. And so we have gone after, we've prosecuted quite a few and taken their medical license. So medication-assisted treatment works, and we've also put it into the drug courts. And that's been a huge challenge because, again, the first thing the judge wants to do is say, just give them Vivitrol. But what we have to do is remind the judge that you practice law and a doctor practices medicine, and with all due respect, you don't want that lawsuit for neglect. Because there's a Kentucky lawsuit because a woman was pregnant taking her methadone as prescribed, and the judge said you have to go off the medication. What do you think happened? Yeah, it was pretty bad. The other piece is counseling, and counseling takes all different forms. I will say this. I like AA, I like NA, I like Smart Decisions, but all of those are fellowships, which is great. You know, sometimes that's what you need. You need to connect with people who have the same situation, who are of like mind, and who can call you on your stuff. Because just like when I used to teach in school, you know what I love? I never really had to get on students because other students would do it for you, right? This is the same, but it is fellowship. And this disease is so complex that sometimes it requires a little bit more in depth. And that can be, again, individual, family, or group counseling. making sure that people believe, because if you think about even 20 years ago, we thought that the brain couldn't recover. We used to tell people, if you do this, this, and this, you're going to have holes in your brain and you're going to be damaged forever, and that's just not true. The brain can recover, the brain can heal. It takes a lot of time. And there's also a holistic approach to how that occurs. But we have to instill hope in people and stop making it like this is a doomed sentence for the rest of your life. It's not. But there has to be some intervention, and it has to be planful. Relationships and reconnection. I don't like that sentence. Yeah. Relationships and or reconnection helps people heal and recover. And this is something I've had to learn throughout my 25 years of doing this work. It's absolutely okay for a person to say, my family is sick and I can't go back. Part of what happened with me was the environment I was in was so toxic and so chaotic that I needed something. I gave you a good example of my own. And giving a person permission is huge. I understand you, I get you, how can I help you get to the next spot? When you're working with young people, and I think you all know it because that's why you're here, being honest, not insulting their intelligence, and showing them often visual works better is a tremendous way to educate about this epidemic. I am more than happy to share my slides with you. I can share other presentations. We have programs across the state. One that we have is Start Talking, and I've heard a lot of flack because you'll hear it's not evidence-based. You're right. Most things aren't evidence-based until you do them over and over. It's predicated upon 50% of young people. The younger you start talking to children, they're 50% less likely to ever become addicted. So the conversation has to occur. Now, the challenge I gave to the people who run Start Talking is, but it goes beyond just talking about drugs. It is talking about sexual relationships, relationships and healthy relationships, how to communicate with people and set boundaries. I love that that kid said that. I know how to set boundaries for myself. That's fantastic. Putting things off on other people is important. What we learned from Start Talking, it's called No Tips. K-N-O-W as in knowledge. You can go to the Start Talking website and get on that. Is that we're not just talking about parents with children, because as a result of this epidemic, we have a large number of relatives who are raising grandchildren, nieces, and nephews. Our foster care system, 75% of the kids who are in foster care are in there as a result of drug addiction. More specifically, 60% of the children who are under the age of 1, it's because of the opiate epidemic. I really have been all over the place, and I acknowledge that. As I heard those things come out, I just needed to give you whatever bits and kernels I've been given along the way. I pray that I have given you the attention, the respect, and the time that you deserve, and thank you. I can take questions.